Good morning and welcome. This fifth and the last one of Miss Wetherby's story, and it's one that takes up the last 3 years of the war. And it follows Clementine and her household in England during the latter half of World War II, of course. The book details the daily struggles of civilian life. It must have been so boring. 5 years of that? Including wartime rationing, the emotional toll of the conflict, and the arrival of the Americans. Central plot points involve a legal dispute over a secretary's stamp collection, Clementine's husband Jeremy being brutally assaulted in London, and the blossoming romance between their friend Aadhirai and a solicitor called Arthur. Throughout these personal stories, the characters navigate a landscape marked by air raids, coal shortages, food shortages, and the persistent hope for an Allied victory. The story culminates in a sense of resilience as the household celebrates a new birth amidst the ongoing global struggle. Oh dear, little anywho. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the AI voices. And if you would like to subscribe and ring that bell, that would be fantastic. Just to support the channel, of course. Anyway, that's the end of the Wetherby series. More books to come. We ain't finished yet.
So, it is January 1st, 1943. You open your eyes, and your head is just pounding with this severity that makes the light in the room feel like an actual physical assault.
Oh, yeah. A terrible start to the year.
Right. You immediately have to lean over the edge of your bed to just vomit into a bucket. It is not exactly the glorious, chest-thumping heroism of World War II that we usually see in the newsreels, you know?
No, absolutely not. There are no soaring strings playing in the background.
Exactly. No booming speeches about fighting on the beaches.
Yeah.
This is the miserable, deeply hungover, incredibly muddy reality of the civilian home front.
It is such a brilliantly visceral, grounding mechanism to start the story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you were looking at a protagonist, Clementine, who has been completely stripped of any of that romantic wartime veneer.
Yeah, she really has.
She is just clutching a bucket that her dear friend Aadhirai provided, and she's suffering the consequences of this mysterious, completely unwanted Christmas present.
Some lethal green alcoholic concoction, right?
Yeah, likely brewed in a bathtub by the grumpy local gardener, Mr. Titchmarsh.
Which is just so perfectly grim. And when she finally manages to drag herself upright and look out her window, the landscape offers absolutely zero comfort.
Just mud and gray.
Yeah, it's a muddled gray jumble of melting snow in her garden. The trees look completely skeletal and dead. But the detail that really sets the hook for me is the sound. Or, well, the lack of it.
Right, the silence.
There is no bird song, none at all. There is just this distant, unbroken, heavy silence that follows the roar of Spitfires flying overhead. It's this intense auditory void.
Which, perfectly mirrors the psychological void of the era.
Mm-hmm.
By January 1943, the adrenaline of the Blitz is just gone.
Totally gone.
The novelty of doing your bit has completely evaporated. The narrator explicitly places us in the fourth full year of the most terribly depressing event of Clementine's life.
4 years of this. It's exhausting.
It really is. The standard post-Christmas melancholy has set in, but it's magnified exponentially by this grim realization that they're staring down yet another 12 months of strict rationing, unpredictable death, and just an absolute lack of control over their own destinies.
Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive, everyone. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the fifth and final novel in a sprawling saga of 5 that chronicles Miss Clementine Wetherby's, well, now Mrs. Howarth's return to London.
It is a heavy one.
It really is. But we aren't just going to recap a plot for you today. We are going to put the psychological endurance of the British home front under a microscope.
Because that's where the real story is.
Exactly. We're unpacking the intensely moral gray areas that are born out of sheer wartime fatigue and the profound, almost desperate ways that chosen families are forged in the fires of national trauma.
It's a fascinating look at survival.
By examining this final chapter of Clementine's journey, you are going to get a deeply intimate perspective on how ordinary people navigated the grinding, messy tail end of a world-shattering conflict. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really understand the decisions these characters make, You have to understand the sheer weight of the fatigue they are carrying. It's not just being tired.
Right.
It is a cellular level exhaustion caused by constant daily deprivation. By 1943, rationing isn't just about skipping sugar in your tea or, like, giving up silk stockings.
It's way past that.
It is bitten down into the absolute bedrock of basic human hygiene and functionality.
That is such a crucial distinction for you to keep in mind as we talk about this. We are talking about the inability to find a simple toothbrush.
Exactly.
A toothbrush. Clementine is a woman who, technically speaking, is quite wealthy. She has a substantial amount of money safely sitting in her bank from her years living in Bombay, but she is discovering that capital is entirely useless when the physical goods simply do not exist.
You can't buy what isn't there.
Factories have been churning out artillery shells and uniforms for 4 years, not bone-handled toothbrushes or decent winter boots.
The domestic economy has been completely cannibalized by the war effort. You can have all the paper money in the world, but if the rubber and leather are going to the front lines, your boots are going to have holes in them.
And the psychological impact of that on someone like Clementine is profound. She actually has this intense moment of guilt where she remembers her life in Bombay.
Oh, the fingernail scene.
Yeah, she recalls a young servant girl whose specific job was to shape Clementine's rough fingernails. It was a life of extreme imperial comfort.
A totally different world.
Now she looks down at her own hands, and they are calloused, rough, and stained from harvesting her own meager vegetables in the Wanstead mud. The contrast is staggering.
The war has acted as this great violent equalizer, but not in a utopian way. It has just dragged everyone down to a baseline of gritty survival.
And when you drag a society down to that baseline of survival, the polite Edwardian rules of propriety just begin to disintegrate.
People simply do not have the caloric energy to maintain polite fictions anymore.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating ethical case studies in the entire saga. The situation between Jeremy Howarth, Clementine's solicitor husband, and a woman named Mrs. Glass.
This scenario is an absolute masterclass in the collapse of societal norms. Let's set the stage for you. Jeremy works as a solicitor in a respectable office in New Fetter Lane.
Right.
He receives a telegram, followed abruptly by a visit from Mrs. Glass. Now, Mrs. Glass is the estranged sister of Jeremy's former secretary, Miss Euphemia Gordon.
And to fully appreciate the tension here, we need to recall Miss Gordon's tragic trajectory from the previous installments.
We do. She was a deeply difficult, intensely unhappy woman who ultimately took her own life.
Which was so tragic.
And she left her entire, albeit meager estate, to Jeremy.
Enter the sister, Mrs. Glass, who has just completed an incredibly dangerous transatlantic journey from Canada in the middle of a U-boat war, and her backstory is horrific.
Unimaginable, really.
Her husband recently died of scarlet fever. We often forget, pre-widespread antibiotics, how devastating these infections were. He was the only man in his military unit to catch it and die from it.
And the cruelty of the quarantine protocols of the time meant she couldn't even hold his hand.
Oh, that's right.
She had to stand outside a hospital ward and watch her husband die through a pane of glass just to prevent the infection from spreading.
It is a staggering trauma. So now she is a widow, the Canadian government has essentially abandoned her financially, and she has crossed an ocean filled with submarines to get to London, demanding whatever inheritance her sister Miss Gordon might have left behind.
But here is the legal reality. Jeremy holds all the cards. He is the sole, indisputable beneficiary of Miss Gordon's will.
Legally, she has nothing.
Right. The estate is mostly a couple of battered suitcases of personal effects. However, there is one item of massive significance. It's a stamp album that originally belonged to Miss Gordon and Mrs. Glass's abusive alcoholic father.
Mrs. Glass knows this album exists, and she suspects it holds value, but she plays her hand terribly. When she visits, she is incredibly bitter.
She really doesn't help herself.
She smokes aggressively in Clementine's private study. She shows zero gratitude for the hospitality, and she just demands the inheritance with this suffocating sense of entitlement.
When she finally leaves, Jeremy realizes he needs to understand exactly what he is legally holding on to. So he takes this album to Stanley Gibbons on the Strand.
And Stanley Gibbons isn't just a shop.
No, it is the absolute epicenter of world philately. Taking a stamped collection there is like taking a painting to Sotheby's.
He meets with an expert named Mr. Duncan. I love the visual the author gives us here. Mr. Duncan has a thick Scottish accent. He's peering through gold pince-nez glasses, carefully turning the pages of this album that survived an abusive household and a suicide.
It's a great scene.
And Mr. Duncan's valuation is completely life-changing. He tells Jeremy that this collection of first-day cover issues is worth a flat, immediate sum of 800 guineas if bought on the spot, and potentially double that if he risks waiting for a July auction.
Let's clarify what guineas means in this context, because it's vital to the psychology of the scene. A guinea was 1 pound and 1 shilling.
Right, the extra shilling.
It was considered the gentleman's currency, used for professional fees, luxury goods, and fine art. Quoting the price in guineas immediately elevates the album from a mere hobbyist collection to a serious aristocratic asset.
It changes everything.
And 800 guineas in 1943 is an astronomical sum. It's the kind of money that could buy a substantial house outright.
So Jeremy is sitting on a fortune that is 100% legally his. Mrs. Glass has no legal claim to a single penny of it, but Jeremy decides to make a move. He reaches out to Mrs. Glass to arrange a meeting.
And this is where the geography tells the whole story.
Yes, the location is everything.
He does not invite her back to his respectable mahogany-paneled legal office in New Fetter Lane.
He insists they meet at the Black Bull. This is a notoriously rough pub situated in Upper Thames Street, right down by the river. It's surrounded by this oily, damp, polluted fog rolling off the Thames. It is a squalid environment.
Why there? Why drag this grieving, albeit awful widow to a dive bar?
That's the question, right?
Because Jeremy is creating a psychological firewall. By meeting her at the Black Bull, he is explicitly separating this transaction from his professional identity and his domestic life.
He's compartmentalizing.
Exactly. He refuses to taint his legal practice or Clementine's home with the messy, morally ambiguous transaction he is about to conduct.
They sit in this low-ceilinged, cramped, smelling of stale beer snug. Jeremy slides an envelope across the table. He has decided to give her a check for half of the immediate value of the album, 400 guineas.
Which is incredibly generous, legally speaking.
But, and this is perhaps the most painfully human detail in the entire novel, he doesn't give her exactly half. He deducts a £2 fee from the check. Why? Simply because her attitude was so terrible.
It is a breathtakingly petty tax on her lack of manners.
It really is.
And her reaction is explosive. Instead of being grateful for a fortune she had no legal right to, she's furious. She looks around the pub, calls the local patrons heathens, and haughtily demands Jeremy's physical protection to go outside and hail a taxi.
And Jeremy's response is ice cold. He basically tells her she's on her own, downs the rest of his beer, wipes the foam from his upper lip, walks out the door, and just leaves her sitting in the fog.
If you were sitting in Jeremy's seat, holding that check, what is the internal calculus? Legally, he owes her nothing.
Nothing at all.
The Edwardian legal framework that defined his entire career tells him the money is his. But he knows the broader context. He knows she suffered under the same abusive father as Miss Gordon.
Right.
He knows she watched her husband suffocate from scarlet fever through a hospital window.
Right, so we have to ask ourselves, is giving her the 400 guineas an act of genuine grace, or is it a cynical payoff? Like, is he buying his own peace of mind because he just can't stand the guilt of holding on to a fortune while the world burns around him?
It is a deeply pragmatic form of grace. It is entirely devoid of warmth, affection, or forgiveness. It is a transaction designed to balance his own spiritual ledger.
A wartime compromise.
In a society where grand concepts of fairness and justice have been obliterated by bombs and casualty lists, people are forced to create their own micro-justice.
Yeah.
Jeremy essentially decides, you deserve something for your suffering, but I am going to charge you £2 for being insufferable while receiving it.
It's brilliant. It perfectly encapsulates how the grinding fatigue of the war has eroded everyone's patience for polite fictions. And that erosion of societal rules isn't just happening in squalid riverside pubs.
It's happening everywhere.
It is tearing apart the most intimate corners of the Wanstead community, which leads us directly to the shocking betrayal known as the Ponsford scandal.
Oh, this is an event that genuinely rocks the local neighborhood and is revealed through Hermione, a 15-year-old maid who works for the Ponsford family.
Clementine happens to run into Hermione while running errands at the local Boots pharmacy. Hermione is visibly distressed, and she drops an absolute bombshell of a story.
About Mrs. Ponsford.
Right. Mrs. Ponsford, the matriarch of the house, has recently passed away. Hermione had grown quite close to her in her final weeks, tending to her. And Hermione reveals that Mrs. Ponsford had one very specific, deeply felt dying wish, which she explicitly wrote into her will.
She wanted to be cremated. She told Hermione that she was terrified of the dark and couldn't bear the thought of being buried in a box and moldering away to nothing in the cold ground.
Such a visceral fear.
Her absolute final desire was for her ashes to be scattered over the beloved rose garden she had cultivated for years.
A beautiful, understandable, and legally documented wish. But what does her husband, Mr. Ponsford, do? He completely and utterly betrays her. He ignores the will. He takes her body and donates it to a hospital for medical use.
It's shocking. Furthermore, he strips her passing of any dignity. He arranges a bare-bones funeral. There are no flowers. There is no wake to celebrate her life.
It's just so cold.
And in an act of profound cruelty, he specifically forbids young Hermione, the one person who provided comfort to his wife at the end, from attending the service.
The fallout in Wanstead is nuclear.
Okay.
Mrs. Ponsford's own adult daughter, Anne, is absolutely enraged. Hermione's father, who is a very strict, rigid Salvation Army captain, is morally appalled.
The whole town turns on him.
The entire community turns on Mr. Ponsford with a ferocity that is stunning. The social ostracization is so absolute that Mr. Ponsford actually loses his standing in local politics, is forced to sell his rubber boot manufacturing company, and flees Wanstead entirely to live in exile by the sea.
Look at the mechanics of why the community reacts this way. By 1943, death is omnipresent.
It's everywhere.
People are being vaporized by high explosives. Soldiers are disappearing into the mud of foreign battlefields. The only control people have left over death is the ritual of it.
That's a great point. The ritual is everything.
Respecting a dying wish is the absolute final bastion of human dignity. When Mr. Ponsford violates that, when he treats his wife's body like surplus medical equipment, he isn't just insulting her. He is violating the unwritten contract of basic humanity that the community is desperately clinging to.
That total erosion of societal rules, the idea that even your dying wishes aren't safe from betrayal, is exactly what primes this community for the absolute chaos of the following year. Because once you've compromised your morals just to get by in 43, what happens when the government suddenly knocks on your door and demands the lives of your children?
That is exactly the terror that takes hold as we move into 1944.
The war stops being this tiring backdrop of rationing and becomes a direct kinetic threat to the chosen families these women have built.
And no one embodies that clash between the domestic sphere and the state machine more dramatically than Lillian Smart, the vicar's wife.
Lillian is one of the most gentle, nervous, unassuming characters in the saga. Yet, in 1944, we discover she has been committing sustained, deliberate acts of treason against the British government.
It centers around the National Service Act. Lillian has two sons, Nigel and Philip. The government has been sending official conscription letters to the vicarage, calling the boys up for active military service.
And Lillian has been intercepting the mail, taking these official government documents and simply destroying them.
Just burning them.
Yeah, she is tossing them in the fire. She is trying to pretend the war doesn't exist by destroying its paperwork.
It is a stunning act of localized denial. But the bureaucracy of the British war machine is relentless. Eventually, the discrepancy is noticed.
They always notice.
The terrifying reality of the state descends on the vicarage. The police arrive in a black van, a deeply ominous visual, and they arrest this mild-mannered vicar's wife for actively interfering with the war effort.
Jeremy Howarth steps in to act as her solicitor, and the scene of her tribunal is one of the most evocative in the entire narrative. They don't go to the grand, imposing architecture of the Old Bailey. Where does this hearing take place?
It takes place in a discarded, bombed-out schoolroom. The windows are likely blown out, the smell of brick dust and cordite still lingering in the plaster. Behind a salvaged, battered wood desk sit two men and an elderly magistrate with snow-white hair.
It is the makeshift, duct-taped machinery of a battered state. They are literally administering justice from the rubble of their own civilization.
It's such a powerful image.
Jeremy stands up in this ruined classroom and delivers a masterful defense. He doesn't argue the facts. She is undeniably guilty. He argues the psychology. He reminds the tribunal that Lillian's husband, the Reverend Donald Smart, has been missing in action for years.
His fate is completely unknown. He vanished into the fog of war, presumed to be a prisoner of war or dead.
Jeremy argues that this immense, ambiguous, lingering trauma has fundamentally broken her capacity for rational compliance. She isn't a fascist sympathizer. She is a deeply traumatized mother.
Right.
Let's put this into a functional analogy. What Lillian is doing is like standing next to a massive, roaring factory assembly line, watching her children moving down the conveyor belt toward the crushers and trying to stop the gears by just throwing her own bare hands into the cogs.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly it.
It is completely futile. The machine
Yeah.
is too big, it is going to crush her hands, but she does it anyway because her biology demands she protect her kids. And here is where the story pivots in a way that feels almost shockingly subversive for the time. The tribunal actually listens to Jeremy.
Astonishingly, yes.
Mm.
The state magistrates drop the charges. They
Yeah.
allow her to go free without a prison sentence.
I look at that decision and I have to wonder, why would the state allow such massive discretionary leeway during a total war? Isn't it almost an admission by the British government that the psychological casualties on the home front are just as real as the physical casualties on the battlefield?
That is exactly what it is. It is an act of bureaucratic triage. The elderly magistrate with the white hair sitting in that bombed-out school understands the human cost because he is sitting inside it.
He's living it too.
The state recognizes that locking up a traumatized mother serves no strategic purpose. They forgive her psychological break. However, the machine of war is inherently amoral and eternally hungry.
They don't let the boys go.
No, they forgive the mother, they still take the sons. The boys are immediately conscripted and driven away in a military vehicle.
The state says, we understand why you did it, but we still need the bodies. It's chilling.
Yeah.
And that relentless threat isn't just bureaucratic. In 1944, the terror is literally falling out of the sky in a completely new, unpredictable way. We are entering the era of the doodlebugs.
The Vergeltungswaffen. The V-1 and V-2 rockets. This marks a massive shift in the psychological warfare of the Blitz.
A huge shift.
Earlier in the war, the Luftwaffe sent bombers. You had radar warnings, you had the wail of the air raid sirens, you had time to scramble to an Anderson shelter. It was terrifying, but it had a structure.
The rockets strip away that structure.
Sure.
We need to clarify the mechanics of these weapons because they dictate the terror. The V-1 was a pulse jet cruise missile. It made a horrific, loud buzzing sound as it flew, hence buzz bomb or doodlebug.
Right, the sound was iconic.
But the terror of the V-1 was that the engine was designed to cut out before it dropped. So you would hear this roaring engine coming closer and closer, and then absolute silence. And in that silence, you knew you had about 10 seconds before it hit the ground and detonated.
And the V-2 was even worse. The V-2 was a supersonic ballistic missile. It traveled faster than the speed of sound. There was no buzzing. There was no engine cutout.
Just boom.
Exactly. There was just instantaneous annihilation from a clear blue sky. You would literally hear the explosion before you heard the rocket approaching.
The unpredictability is paralyzing. The government has actually relaxed the lighting restrictions at this point. They've moved from a total blackout to a dim out, allowing moonlight levels of street lighting because the traditional German bomber fleet has been decimated. But these unmanned rockets don't need targets. They just fall.
And what makes the anxiety even more suffocating is that the British government actively lies about it to prevent mass panic.
Yes. Jeremy learns from his intelligence contact, Emma Foster, about the government's cover-up. When a rocket hits a residential neighborhood, the newspapers are instructed to report it as a wayward gas explosion.
It's such a brazen lie.
There is a specific incident mentioned, a massive detonation in Chiswick that obliterates 15 houses and kills 3 people. The papers print that a gas main ruptured. Everyone on the street knows a gas main doesn't leave a crater that looks like a meteor strike, but the cognitive dissonance is enforced by the state.
You are living in a society where you know the sky can kill you at any second, and your own government is telling you it's just faulty plumbing. It breeds a profound sense of isolation and fatalism.
And death does arrive in Wanstead, but ironically, it bypasses the high-tech rockets entirely. It comes in the most mundane biological way possible. Mr. Titchmarsh, the grumpy, cynical gardener who has been tending Clementine's vegetable plots, suddenly drops dead of a massive stroke.
Which leaves his 13-year-old daughter, Mary, completely orphaned in the middle of a war zone.
And this is where we see the fierce, aggressive, maternal instinct of the home front snap into action. Clementine doesn't form a committee. She doesn't hesitate.
She just acts.
The moment Titchmarsh is gone, Clementine physically takes Mary into Bilmont House. She absorbs her into her chosen family.
But this state, ever present, attempts to intervene. A welfare officer from Ilford, a highly bureaucratic, pompous woman named Mrs. Hargreaves, arrives to assess the situation.
Mrs. Hargreaves.
The state's default protocol for an orphan child of the working class in 1944 is to place them in a council-run orphanage.
Clementine goes to war with Mrs. Hargreaves. She has to vehemently prove that her sprawling, unconventional household, filled with refugees, friends, and maids, is a vastly superior environment to a sterile, state-run institution, and she wins. Clementine officially becomes Mary's foster mother.
It is the ultimate counter-narrative to the destruction of the war. While the global conflict is violently dismembering biological families, the women on the home front are actively, fiercely suturing new ones together out of the wreckage.
But the shadow of Tishmarsh's death still lingers, and Clementine insists on paying for his entire funeral out of her own pocket. She hires Wetherby and Son, the local funeral directors. But the logistics of burying him reveal how fractured the community has become.
The local diocese in Wanstead outright refuses to allow him to be buried in their churchyard. The narrative implies it's due to his prickly nature or perhaps his lack of church attendance, but the result is a long, grim procession.
They have to drive the hearse all the way to West Ham Cemetery, finally laying him to rest in plot A1255 under a cluster of oak trees. But what truly magnifies Clementine's melancholy isn't the location. It's the attendance.
Or the lack thereof.
Exactly. Who shows up for the man who spent his entire life tending the gardens of Wanstead? Just Clementine, Mary, a tiny handful of locals, and 2 men in their home guard uniforms. That's it.
It is a devastating portrait of communal isolation. By 1944, people are so consumed by their own immediate survival, so emotionally bankrupt from hoarding their grief for their own families, that the capacity for broader communal mourning has simply vanished.
They just don't have it in them anymore.
Titchmarsh slips beneath the soil almost entirely unremarked upon by the society he served.
It is a bleak, chaotic reality, and when you are surrounded by that much random death and isolation, the human mind starts grasping for any semblance of control or foresight, which pulls us into a fascinating, almost supernatural pivot in the story as we approach the end of the war.
We need to examine the role of Ada, Clementine's niece, and her deeply unsettling premonitions.
Ada is a character who operates on a completely different frequency than the rest of Belmont House. Throughout the saga, she has demonstrated these undeniable psychic impressions. And her most famous, overarching prediction was establishing exactly when the nightmare would end. She foresaw that the war would conclude in the summer of 1945.
A prediction that provided a vital psychological anchor for Clementine. But as 1935 actually approaches, Ada's visions become drastically more specific and infinitely more terrifying.
They get so dark.
She confides in Clementine about an impression she has received regarding the final decisive blow of the global conflict.
She tells Clementine that the end will be brought about by 2 things, H and N.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It is chilling to read, but notice the mechanics of her vision. She doesn't see B-29 bombers. She doesn't see the complex physics of splitting the atom or the geopolitical maneuverings of the Manhattan Project.
No, it's not literal like that.
She experiences it purely as a sensory horror. She describes receiving an overwhelming impression of intense heat and creeping evil.
It is a fascinating narrative choice by the author. By filtering the dawn of the nuclear age through Ada's raw psychic dread, the novel captures the subconscious terror of the era. The world was about to cross a threshold of destruction that the human mind literally did not have the vocabulary to process yet.
Right.
Ada feels the existential weight of the atomic bomb before the public even knows the word uranium.
But what I find so compelling is how the novel immediately undercuts Ada's supernatural foresight with the brutal biological reality of being a woman in the 1940s. Ada might be able to see the atomic end of the war, but she cannot foresee the mortal danger of her own body.
The birth scene.
Yeah, Ada goes into labor with her baby, Harry, and the delivery is a catastrophic medical emergency.
She suffers a severe complication immediately following the birth. She develops a condition the medical terminology of the time referred to as a crisis of the lochia.
Let's break down the medical reality of that for you, because the term kind of obscures the terror. Lochia is the normal postpartum discharge of blood and tissue, but Ada begins to hemorrhage massively.
It's so dangerous.
In an era before rapid response blood banks were standard in every local hospital, postpartum hemorrhage is a ticking clock to exsanguination. She is bleeding to death in her own bed. She slips into unconsciousness, her pulse threading.
The official British doctor has not arrived. The only medical presence in the room is her midwife, Mrs. Baker.
And this is where the narrative delivers one of its most profound revelations. Mrs. Baker is a Dutch refugee. She arrived in England 3 years prior, fleeing the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands.
Just another refugee to most people.
To the Wanstead community, she is just a quiet, competent, foreign woman who helps deliver babies. But that is a forced identity.
Before the Wehrmacht rolled into Rotterdam, Mrs. Baker was not a midwife. She was a highly esteemed, fully qualified pediatric surgeon at Rotterdam's primary hospital.
Think about the mechanics of wartime bureaucracy here. Because she's a foreign refugee, the British medical establishment refuses to recognize her credentials.
It's maddening.
She is legally barred from practicing medicine or performing surgery in the UK. The state has taken a brilliant, highly trained surgeon and functionally demoted her to a midwife.
But as Ada begins to bleed out, the bureaucracy ceases to matter. Mrs. Baker drops the guise of the simple midwife. Her suppressed brilliance takes over.
She steps up.
She utilizes her surgical expertise, her deep knowledge of anatomy and crisis management to stabilize the hemorrhage and literally pull Ada back from the brink of death before the official doctor ever walks through the door.
And we have to mention the heartbreaking parallel the author weaves into Mrs. Baker's backstory. Why is she alone? What happened to her husband?
He died of scarlet fever. Exactly the same disease that killed Mrs. Glass's husband in Canada.
It's this hidden subterranean web of grief connecting these women across continents. And I look at this scene with Ada bleeding on the bed and Mrs. Baker stepping up, and I have a thought.
What's that?
We just spent time marveling at Ada's psychic premonitions, the H&N, the mystical foresight. But doesn't focusing on the magic distract us from the actual miracle? Isn't Mrs. Baker the true hero here?
I think so, absolutely.
The narrative seems to be telling us that while fate and premonitions are interesting, it is the tangible, gritty, suppressed brilliance of refugees like Mrs. Baker that actually sustains human life.
You hit the nail on the head regarding the novel's thematic core. Ada's visions provide a structural framework. They tell us the future is coming. But human agency is what ensures we survive to see it.
Right.
Mrs. Baker represents the tragic displacement of European intellect. How many brilliant scientists, doctors, and artists were forced to hide their talents, scrubbing floors or delivering babies in foreign countries, just to survive? Her saving Ada is a profound vindication of that displaced brilliance.
It is a victory of human skill over chaotic circumstances. And speaking of refugees finding a measure of victory, the novel gives us a beautifully resolved subplot involving Wolfgang.
Oh, Wolfgang. The German refugee who's been years interned, misunderstood, and treated with suspicion simply because of his accent.
Clementine and Aadhirai receive a lengthy letter from him. He is living down in Tilbury, near the docks, and he has managed to carve out a genuinely happy ending. He marries his sweetheart, Annabelle.
And in a bit of karmic justice, Annabelle's tyrannical, controlling father has passed away.
Finally.
Annabelle inherits his estate on the Isle of Man, successfully defeating her grasping, angry sister Betty in the legal dispute.
And with this newfound stability, Wolfgang outlines his plan for the future. He is going to buy a Nissen hut in Chadwell, St. Mary.
We should explain what a Nissen hut is because it speaks volumes about the post-war mindset.
Yeah, please do.
A Nissen hut is a prefabricated half-cylinder structure made of corrugated steel. They were invented during the First World War and used extensively in the Second as barracks or supply depots. They are drafty, they are visually utilitarian, and they are the absolute definition of austerity architecture.
But to Wolfgang, a man who has been imprisoned and stateless, a Nissen hut isn't austere. It is a fortress. It is a piece of land and a roof of steel that belongs entirely to him and his wife. It is the ultimate symbol of shelter and stability after years of being buffeted by geopolitics.
It is a quiet, beautiful domestic triumph. But the author doesn't let us bask in it for long.
Well, never for long.
Because the novel immediately takes the greatest geopolitical triumph of the 20th century VE Day, Victory in Europe, May 1945, and juxtaposes it with sudden, horrific domestic tragedy.
The streets of London are absolute pandemonium. Hitler is dead. The war in Europe is over. Millions of people are pouring into the streets, weeping, cheering, fueled by relief and exhaustion. But that joy does not reach Belmont House.
Because Hermione.
Right. The diligent 15-year-old maid who was so deeply affected by the Ponsford scandal. Hermione goes out into the West End to join the VE Day celebrations. She wants to feel the joy of the crowd, but the crowd is not a rational entity. It is a massive, surging organism of manic energy.
Hermione gets caught in a severe crowd crush. The sheer physical pressure of thousands of bodies pushing against each other pins her. Her arm is severely crushed and injured in the panic.
She is pulled from the crowd and taken to the hospital. But the crushing injury is only the beginning. This is 1945. Penicillin exists, but it is still largely reserved for the military. Civilian hospitals are often rationing it. Hermione's crushed arm develops a horrific secondary infection.
The wound erupts in terrifying pustules. The infection breaches her bloodstream. She spikes a massive fever, slips into a state of delirious unconsciousness, and begins a terrifying slide towards sepsis and death.
Think about the irony here. While the entire nation is out in the streets celebrating the fact that they have finally stopped dying, this young girl is rotting in a hospital bed, physically broken by the celebration itself.
She completely misses the end of the war.
But as Clementine sits by her bedside during her agonizingly slow recovery, Hermione reveals the true source of her trauma, and it has nothing to do with the Nazis.
Clementine asks her if she wants her parents notified of her critical condition, and Hermione practically begs her not to.
She's terrified of them.
She confesses the reality of her childhood under her strict, fanatical Salvation Army parents.
It is a story of intense psychological and physical abuse masked as religious piety. Hermione tells Clementine how her parents would force her and her brothers to eat plain margarine at the table, while the parents themselves consumed rich butter. And as the children ate the margarine, the parents would look at them and call them the devil's spawn.
Furthermore, they employed a terrifying method of public shaming. They forced the children to stand at the front of the congregation every single week and loudly confess their supposed sins to the entire church.
Hermione is terrified that if her parents walk into that hospital ward and see her arm covered in pustules, they won't offer comfort. They will view the infection as righteous, divine punishment from God for her going out to celebrate in the West End.
This revelation is the thematic crescendo of the novel's exploration of trauma. The geopolitical war is over. The maps have been redrawn.
But the personal trauma is just beginning.
But the domestic war, the abuse, the scars, the psychological damage inflicted behind closed doors is fully exposed. Hermione's arm will eventually heal, but the trauma of the margarine and the public confessions is a permanent architecture in her mind.
The war in Europe ends with treaties and parades, but the war inside the minds of the survivors has no formal surrender. And no one embodies that grim reality more devastatingly than the figure who finally walks back into their lives in Section 4, the return of Reverend Smart.
This sequence is perhaps the most profound theological and psychological crisis in the entire narrative. For years, Lillian Smart has been living in the agonizing limbo of not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. Then the telegram arrives at Jeremy's office in the city.
It's from Emma Foster, the intelligence contact. The message is incredibly brief but completely earth-shattering. D. Smart is disembarking at Dover. He is alive.
He's made it back.
He has been liberated from the Dachau concentration camp. Emma is escorting him directly to Jeremy's legal office in New Fetter Lane.
Lillian, accompanied by Clementine and Aadhirai, makes the journey into the city of London. They're waiting in Jeremy's office, and the tension is suffocating. They have no idea what condition he will be in physically or mentally.
You can picture the elevator doors sliding open. Emma Foster steps out, and behind her walks Donald Smart. The visual description is haunting. He is emaciated, his face gaunt and hollowed out.
A ghost of a man.
He moves with a slow, agonizing deliberation, as if every step requires a conscious negotiation with his own body.
But the physical devastation, as shocking as it is, pales in comparison to the spiritual devastation he immediately unleashes.
Lillian rushes forward, tears in her eyes, crying out his name. She calls him Donald, and she reaches for him. But he physically recoils. He steps backward.
He won't let her touch him.
He looks at his wife, and in a voice completely devoid of emotion, he says, "I am just Mr. Smart now, nothing else." He absolutely refuses to be addressed as Reverend.
He doesn't stop there. Standing in that quiet legal office, he formally announces that he no longer believes in the canon law of the Church of England.
He just drops it all.
He explicitly states his intention to permanently renounce his ordination vows and the functions of his ministry, and he delivers the final logistical blow. He refuses to ever set foot in a church rectory again.
Lillian is devastated. Her entire identity is wrapped up in being the vicar's wife. She looks at this hollowed-out man who used to be her husband and asks, "Trembling, you mean you no longer believe in God?"
To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, we have to look at the theological crisis that swept through Europe following the liberation of the camps. Donald Smart was raised in an Edwardian Victorian framework of morality.
Right, the very specific worldview.
The Anglican theology he preached was built on the foundation of a benevolent, intervening God, an overarching structure of divine justice.
And then he was put on a train to Dachau.
Exactly. How does a man who has witnessed the industrialized, systematic extermination of human beings in the mud of Dachau return to a polite suburban parish in Wanstead and preach a sermon about a loving, protective God? He cannot. The evidence of absolute, unchecked human evil has completely obliterated his theological framework.
Let me give you an analogy to try and capture what has happened to his mind. Imagine a towering, intricate, beautifully colored stained glass window in a cathedral. That window represents Donald's faith. Now imagine a high-explosive bomb detonating in the nave.
Complete destruction.
The window is blown outwards into a million jagged shards. Now, you can sweep those shards off the pavement, you can try to glue them back together, but you can never put that window back into the stone frame and pretend it is the same window. The light will never shine through it the same way again. It is permanently fractured.
That is precisely it. Donald hasn't merely lost his face the way one misplaces a set of keys. His faith was actively, violently murdered by the reality he witnessed. The vocabulary of the Church of England is suddenly woefully insufficient to explain the Holocaust.
And the novel brilliantly illustrates how this trauma manifests not just in grand theological declarations, but in microscopic sensory details. Emma Foster arranges a taxi to drive them all back from the city to Wanstead. They pull up outside Clementine's house, Belmont House.
Donald opens the door of the taxi. He steps 1 foot out onto the pavement. He closes his eyes, tilts his head back, and takes a long, deep breath through his nose.
And what does he say? Someone is growing lavender.
It is a moment of pure sensory re-anchoring. The smell of the lavender from Clementine's garden hits him. It is the absolute antithesis of the smell of Dachau.
It's life.
It is simple, it is natural, it is deeply English, and it is entirely untainted by human cruelty.
He has to rebuild his connection to humanity entirely from scratch, relying solely on basic physical senses because the grand philosophies have failed him. And the depth of his trauma is so profound that he is terrified of his own biology.
He refuses to sleep in the same bed as Lillian.
More heartbreakingly, he refuses to even look at his own children right away. He tells Lillian, "Satan eggs me on to frighten them." He views his own damaged psyche as a toxic contagion that he needs to quarantine away from his family.
It is the ultimate tragic paradox of his survival. He survived the camp, but the man who loved Lillian and preached in Wanstead died there. A new, shattered man has come back in his body.
And Donald's arrival, this shattering of the old world, coincides with another emotional departure that signals the true end of the wartime era for Belmont House. Concurrently, Emma Foster, who seems to be managing everyone's logistics at this point, arranges for Kaz to leave.
Kaz is the young French refugee who has been living with Ada and Nicholas. She's become deeply embedded in their chosen family, forming a particularly profound attachment to a young boy named Colin Ridley.
But the war is over, and miraculously, Emma Foster discovers that Kaz's biological parents have survived the occupation in Paris. The pull of biological blood, of returning to her true origins, is too strong.
She has to go back.
She is reluctant to leave the safety of Wanstead, but she must go. She packs her bags, says a tearful goodbye, but she makes a very specific promise to young Colin. She promises him that she will return.
Kitzfoss's departure and Donald's return fundamentally dismantle the wartime ecosystem of Belmont House. The immediate kinetic danger of the Blitz and the rockets is over. The state of exception has lifted. The landscape of their lives is permanently altered.
Which leaves us, as listeners, staring at a massive question mark. We've watched these people survive rationing, bombs, tribunals, and the death of their faith. But what happens on a random Tuesday in 1955? Or 1970?
How do you just go back to normal?
Exactly. How do deeply traumatized people navigate the boring, mundane decades of peace that follow?
The author refuses to leave that question unanswered. Which brings us to our final exploration, the epilogue and the long, rippling echoes of the war.
I have to say, when I first read this epilogue, I was stunned by the scope of it. The saga doesn't roll the credits in 1945 with people cheering in the streets. The author provides a hyper-detailed, sprawling timeline that tracks the fates of these characters through the entire back half of the 20th century and, for some, all the way into the early 21st century.
Let's look at the central pillar of the story, Jeremy and Clementine. Jeremy, who spent the war navigating moral tightropes in pubs and bombed-out schools, finally attempts to fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming a barrister.
He goes for it.
He makes the leap, but the cognitive load proves too much. At the age of 55, he realizes his memory is beginning to fail him. He can no longer track the intricate, rigorous demands of the courtroom.
So he makes a pragmatic choice. He gives up the wig and gown, retires early, and he and Clementine spend the remaining years traveling the world. They escape the damp gloom of London. And Clementine, the woman who dragged herself out of bed, hungover and terrified in 1943, lives an incredibly long life.
She makes it all the way to 1976.
She doesn't pass away until July of 1976. She reaches the grand age of 92.
And the detail of her passing is a beautiful testament to the themes of the novel. Who is sitting by her bed, holding her hand as she dies? It is Aadhirai. The friend who handed her the bucket in 43 is the friend who holds her hand in 76.
Aadhirai outlives her and ensures that Clementine's headstone reflects the truth of her existence. It doesn't list grand accomplishments. It simply reads, Clementine Haworth, a fine lady and friend.
That's lovely.
It cements the idea that the chosen family they built in the crucible of the war was the most enduring achievement of her life.
We also see the next generation fulfill their promises. Cass, the French refugee, keeps her word to young Colin Ridley. She eventually returns from France, they reunite, and they marry.
They don't go on to live grand, glamorous lives either.
No, they run a simple electrical shop in Wanstead. They find profound stability in the mundane, living long, quiet lives together, both passing away in their 90s in the year 2018.
2018. It connects the trauma of the Plits directly to the modern era. And what about Hermione? The maid who was crushed in the VE Day crowd and scarred by her Salvation Army parents.
She finds her own peace.
She and her closest friend, Bella, move to Barkingside. They both become school teachers. They decide to live together, creating their own sanctuary. They never marry men. They dedicate their lives to education, and they pass away within a month of each other in the late 2000s.
And then there is Ada. Ada and Nicholas leave London and run a hotel in Great Yarmouth on the coast. But the most fascinating detail about Ada is what happens to her mind. By the time she reaches her 50th birthday, her psychic visions, the premonitions that predicted Hiroshima, completely fade away.
I look at this sprawling timeline, the fading magic, the quiet lives, and I have to wonder, is this level of detail actually necessary? It almost feels like the author is just indulging in tying up every single loose end. Why do we need to know exactly what year Cass died or that Ada lost her visions?
It's a fair question.
Is there a deeper psychological reason we need these neat historical bow ties after a narrative so dominated by war?
It is absolutely vital to the psychological closure of the narrative. Think about what war is. War is the ultimate thief of agency. It drops a bomb on your house, it conscripts your sons, it tells you what you can eat and where you can walk. The war in 43 and 44 was terrifyingly devoid of neat endings. People vanished into camps or were vaporized by rockets.
Right, there's no closure.
By providing this extensive mundane epilogue, the author is actively reclaiming the character's agency from the chaos of history. The fading of Ada's visions is deeply symbolic. Her psychic ability was a hypervigilant survival mechanism.
The magical thinking.
It was the magical thinking required to navigate a world that made no logical sense. But once she is running a hotel in peacetime Great Yarmouth, she no longer needs to predict the apocalypse. The world normalizes, and so the magic leaves her. The epilogue assures the audience that despite the horrific interruption of World War II, these people got to dictate the terms of their own decline. It is the ultimate victory over the chaos.
But the author is also careful not to paint a purely utopian picture. The epilogue is starkly realistic about the fact that some trauma is simply permanent. There are tragic, unresolved divergences.
Lillian's twin daughters, Rose and Hilary, the girls whose brothers were conscripted, grow up to become entirely estranged. The novel gives no specific reason, reflecting the baffling, quiet tragedies of real families. They never speak to each other again, eventually dying a month apart in their 80s.
We learn that Miss Millie Robinson, the troubled neighbor from earlier in the saga, dies relatively young at 52, and because she is entirely alone, her estate reverts to the crown. And Susan Freeman, the sister of the local butcher, lives to be 98 years old but becomes completely uncommunicative, dying alone and leaving everything she owns to a dog's home.
This realism is what elevates the ending. It reflects the absolute truth of trauma and recovery. Some wounds, like Cass and Colin's separation, heal beautifully with time. Some bonds, like Clementine and Aadhirai or Hermione and Bella, prove completely unbreakable, forged like steel under pressure.
But some fractures just never mend.
Exactly. Like Donald Smart's faith, or the relationship of the Smart twins, they simply never mend. They just carry the limp for the rest of their lives.
It is like standing on the shore of a pond and watching the ripples slowly stilling years after a massive, jagged boulder was dropped into the water. The boulder is the Second World War. The initial violent splash is 1945. But the ripples continue outward for decades, subtly dictating where these people end up in the 70s, the 90s, and all the way into the 2000s.
History isn't just what happens to nations on grand treaty signing days. It's what happens to neighborhoods over the course of a century.
Exactly. Let's pull all of this together. The fifth novel of Miss Wetherby's saga is so much more than a story about the geopolitical victory of the Allied forces. It is a profound, microscopic exploration of the domestic front. It shows us how grinding, cellular fatigue eroded societal norms, like we saw with Jeremy charging Mrs. Glass a £2 fee for being rude, or Mr. Ponsford betraying his wife's dying wish just to be rid of her ashes.
It illustrates the aggressive, defiant way women rebuilt families from the ashes of tragedy, like Clementine physically pulling young Mary Titchmarsh into her home, battling the state welfare bureaucracy to do it.
And it proves that the true cost of war isn't just paid in the currency of borders and shattered economies. It is paid in the currency of shattered faith. It is paid in Donald Smart refusing to use the title of Reverend because the vocabulary of God cannot explain dacho. We so often look at history through grand, sweeping dates, September 1st, 1939, May 8th, 1945.
But the dates don't tell the whole story.
But real history is lived in the muddy winter gardens. It's lived in the agonizing wait for a toothbrush. It's lived in the moral compromises we make when the laws of civilization break down, and the quiet, unending grief of the everyday person who just wants the sky to stop falling.
It challenges you to look at the macro events of our own time and consider the micro fissures they are creating in your own neighborhood, your own family.
It absolutely does. It begs you, the listener, to consider how the global chaos of right now is quietly shaping the domestic architecture of your own life. So we're going to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day.
A parting thought.
Think about Donald Smart stepping out of that taxi onto the pavement in Wanstead, closing his eyes, smelling the lavender after surviving the absolute unimaginable worst of human capability. If everything you fundamentally believed in, your entire moral, spiritual, and philosophical framework, was violently stripped away from you, what is the first, simple, ordinary, sensory thing you would reach for to anchor yourself back to the world?
A profound question to carry with you.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you next time.